Vuori's been taking the athleisure category by storm since 2015. In November, they announced $850 million in new funding. I can't even imagine that amount of money. Can they use that to grow category share in athleisure? That all has to do with two things. One is, can they stop the freight train growth of Alo Yoga, which has a very similar competitive customer set and ticket size? And then two, can they use that funding to grow their market share with a very specific consumer, a very wealthy suburban consumer that Lululemon is so entrenched with? In this video, we're going to do a full brand teardown on Vuori using the consumer code framework. First, looking at their customer set. Who are their best customers? How do they stack up against competition? What channels are they using to target their ideal customer? The culture they're operating in the athleisure category in 2025, the creative copy they're using to personalize their advertisements, and then finally conversion. Does it actually work? So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so who's Vuori selling to? The answer will both show you why they've done well so far and why they're going to have a tough row to hoe in the future. So if we look here at their revenue share, they're doing really well with the millennial generation. And if we dive into specifically percent penetrated, we see Gen Z popping up higher. That's good for Vuori. Why are they not even higher than that? The next thing I'm going to show you will show you a lot about Vuori's customers. So we can look at penetration by income level. And holy smokes, Batman, the higher income segments are definitely Vuori's customers. They do well with a very wealthy and affluent customer. Now, what type of wealthy and affluent customer? The next thing we'll show you will give you a sense of that. So we can look at the psychographic segments here to get a better sense of the lifestyles of their customers. And what we're seeing here is both a very urban customer and an active and professional customer they have the highest penetration with. Now, these urban segments are not necessarily the largest segments as far as population, so sometimes it's nice to see revenue share by segment, and you're going to see one segment pop up that wasn't there before, and that is suburb chic. This is a relatively wealthy segment that lives further out, obviously, into the suburbs. Now, this is where the competition is going to get very interesting, because if we swap this, we can look at Vuori versus Lululemon. What do you see pop up to the top? Suburb chic makes up the majority of Lululemon's revenue share. 8% of all Lululemon's dollars coming in is suburb chic. And then if we also look at Alo Yoga here, pattern suburb chic is again at the top. So this is going to be an important segment for Vuori to penetrate, and they don't have a very high penetration versus their competition there right now. And right now they're doing better with urban and wealthy segments. So part of this will be wondering, how exactly do they get at that suburb chic segment that makes up a lot of the population? Over 2 million households fall into that segment. Another thing to consider with Vuori is their makeup between the men's and females lines. So if we look at this by gender, we can see that 42% of their customers are male. And we can compare that to Alo Yoga, where 33% of their customers are male. And then Lululemon, where 36% of their customers are male. And so what this tells you is that Vuori is doing better with the male segment. It's unique to them, but we know that a lot of the athleisure spending is actually coming from the female segment. It is something that they're going to have to be making up in the future if they want to compete with these two brands. In the next video, we're going to look specifically at competition and how Vuori can attack those customer segments. Okay, how does Vuori stack up against the competition? What we're looking at here is a few competitive brands, and we're looking at their share of wallet within those brands. We see Vuori starting at 9%, and they finish at almost 12% at the end of the year. That's great growth in this category, but a few things that we just can't ignore. Lululemon just making up the majority of sales, over 50% market share in this category. And then I think the big thing here is Alo, starting at 6% market share, finishing at 9%. But look at this Black Friday sale. They went up to 14% market share, almost 15% briefly. And if you look at their sales this year versus the same month last year, that's where the story really starts to get interesting, where you see that Vuori is up as much as maybe 31%. Compared to last year. On Alo, on the other hand, they're up at 90%, up 80%, and then in their holiday sales up 123% compared to this month last year. So they have just got some freight train growth going on right now. And to look at it a little bit more closely, we can see that they're competing really closely because Vuori and Alo Yoga has around the same ticket size, hovering just under $200, whereas Lululemon is about $140. That's probably why they're getting some of those average income and more suburban segments. As it relates to that, I think an interesting metric we can look at is we only look at share of wallet within very urban and high income active consumers. So that'd be our educated urbanite segment. See Vuori doing pretty good here, 14% to now 23% market share within that segment. But again, Alo Yoga also taking market share here as well, Lululemon being less dominant. So this gives us an indicator of where Vuori should start and then how they should eventually go to attack the market. So we're going to look at them versus Alo Yoga and Lululemon directly. How can they compete and win market share against those two brands in the next video? Okay, so how do you compete with Lululemon if you're a Vuori? It's helpful to see your market segments on an XY axis. On the Y axis, we've got Lululemon. We can see they're doing better with some of these more suburban average income segments. On the X axis, we have Vuori doing better with smaller, more niche urban high income segments. So we see high risers, for example, representing 1.1 million households. So they're smaller bubble than Babies, Burbs, and Blessings, which is like 3.4 million households. But right here at the top is the one that we really need to focus on if we want to take some market share from Lululemon, which is suburb chic, making up 8% of both Vuori and Lululemon's revenue share. And then they represent 2.9 million total households. So Vuori are already making some inroads here, but if they really want to take business away from Lululemon, this is the segment that they need to be focusing on. Now, remember, they do really well with these urban segments, and they don't really have stores near suburb chic. So what I recommend for them is a two-part strategy where they continue to plant physical stores near those urban centers, continue to do well with some of those more urban high-income segments, but plant them in proximity, driving distance from suburb chic. In the meantime, they need to be winning the air war on e-commerce. And they need to find the zip codes where suburb chic are starting to get a density of sales. And then they need to eventually move into those zip codes to then begin taking physical brick and mortar space and market share away from Lululemon. I think another question that we need to ask is how do they compete specifically with Alo Yoga, given Alo Yoga's recent growth? So we're going to look at Alo Yoga's revenue share here. We can just type in Alo. And what we're seeing here is that straight line just means that these folks are directly competitive. Both of them doing really well with Midas Might. Both of them doing really well with suburb chic. Alo Yoga doing a little bit better with suburban segments. Vuori doing a little bit better slightly with these urban segments, but it is really, really close. So one thing that I noticed about Alo is if you look at purchase frequency for Vuori, base is 2.15, meaning the average customer comes 2.15 times, versus if you look at Alo's purchase frequency, you can see their base is 2.2. Now, that doesn't seem like a big difference, but when you have $825 million in funding and you believe that you're going to expand, the lifetime value of that customer is going to become really important. And it looks like, theoretically, the lifetime value for an Alo Yoga customer is higher than Vuori. I think Vuori has an opportunity here to focus on that metric and make sure that people are coming back repeatedly. Alo Yoga is doing a lot of really good things with community. Vuori needs to make their own step in that direction, whether that be LTV or e-commerce or some sort of email campaign. They need to up that purchase frequency to begin taking market share from Alo Yoga and then expanding the value of each one of those customers. In the next video, we're going to walk through what are the top segments that Vuori needs to focus on in order to expand their market share. Let's talk about Vuori's opportunity for channel growth. With their segments, it makes a lot of sense for influencers and digital advertising, but they are best in class at both of those. So I'm going to focus on the third lever, which is opening brick and mortar locations. I'm going to recommend two markets for them. And the first one is probably surprising. It's an existing market where they're at currently that I believe that can bear another location, and that is the Atlanta market. Now, what we have here is our top 5 target segments that we know are competitive against Alo and Lulu visualized. And I can see in our Atlanta market here that they are currently in. We can look at a radius around that location and we can see that, yes, this should be a really good location for him because they have a lot of the target segments already there. But I also believe that just north of that location here is another opportunity for them to focus on the suburb chic segment that is present in this location. We can see they make up 8,709 households in a 3-mile radius, and Vuori can pull further than that as well. Okay, and then what is the new market? I think they should consider Columbus as a new market. I think it makes a lot of sense for them. There's a lot of their segments, both the young professionals in the Columbus market, but also a lot of the suburb chic as well. So I'm recommending an area a little bit further north than what you might expect from the downtown. We can see in a 3-mile radius here, they have 8,314 total households that are within their ideal segment parameters. Okay, creative and copy. How is Vuori doing personalizing the right offer to the right audience? I've got their meta ads library pulled up and we can see 3 pretty clear patterns showing up. Number 1 is that they are heavily focusing on their women's line, and in particular their Bliss Blend line. I believe this is designed to cover that market gap that they have in women's wallet share compared to Alo Yoga and Lululemon. The second thing you'll notice is they have a number of influencer partnerships, which makes sense given their segments. And the third thing that you'll notice is they cover a lot of different sports categories. The ones they're covering are pretty good as it relates to their segments. This is the one that I actually got retargeted with when I went to their website. It's featuring cycling. And if you think about their 2 segments that they're really going after, it's that affluent urban segment. So high risers is one of those. And if we just look at what those people are interested in based on their brand influence, if we look at their top fitness brands, SoulCycle and Peloton showing up pretty high here. So cycling is definitely something that they would be interested in. But I think what they need to be focusing on in the future is this suburb chic segment. And they do have some golf style partnerships, but in their brand influence, in their top news publishers, Golf Digest showing up really high here, the podcast they listen to, Foreplay, another golf related podcast. So I think as they continue to move into suburb chic, they need to be thinking about golf influencer partnerships. Okay, is Vuori's strategy actually working, and what are 3 recommendations we can make for them to win in 2025? So the short of it is when you go from 9% market share to 12% market share within a year in the competitive athleisure category, whatever you are doing is working. That sets them up really well for 2025, especially with now $850 million in funding. And this is a category that's $120 billion right now and is supposed to grow 8% year over year. But if they want to really take market share in 2025, I got 3 recommendations for them. Step number 1 is, yes, continue to put your brick and mortar stores in dense urban locations, but start pelting the suburbs around those stores, in particular, these zip codes that have that high income suburban consumer that Lululemon does so well with. Start pelting them with advertisements. Now they're going to be a little bit more expensive. Suburb chic is a segment that is pretty competitive on social media in the auction, but these people are going to be great brick and mortar customers as well. And so what you do is you look at when you have a density of conversions in that particular zip code, and that is your site selection strategy. Then you can start moving further out into the suburbs and taking that competitive segment. Okay, that's step number 1. Step number 2 is more of a defense against Alo Yoga, and that is really considering the LTV of your customers. So here's a stat that's pretty interesting. If you look at Alo Yoga's average customer spend across a year, it's $410. But if you look at Vuori's average customer spend, it's a bit lower. It's $377. Why is that? Well, it has everything to do with frequency. Now, this doesn't sound like a big number. Vuori's customers are typically coming 2.15 times within a 12-month period, and then Alo's comes 2.2 times, but you saw it's $377 versus $400 a customer. This is going to be even more important to Vuori as they expand their customer base with that new funding. The more customers you have, the bigger lever LTV is. And this, I would recommend doing a very strategic and personalized email campaign to their current customer set. The third one, and this is really low-hanging fruit, it's just expanding that women's product line. If we look at Vuori versus Lululemon, for example, you're going to see that Lululemon, a lot of their share is actually coming from females in particular. Now, this is unique with Vuori since they entered as a male brand, very much dominant in that gender. But I think there's an opportunity to grow here because it seems like females are making the majority of athleisure type purchases. And that is how Vuori can win in 2025.